Hello and welcome to Talking Books. I'm Jill de Villiers. It was a shocking story in the news back in 2012. A Cape Flats activist leading the charge for a commission of inquiry into policing in Khayelitsha found herself on trial for necklacing and murdering a young neighbourhood troublemaker. My guest today is writer and researcher Simone Haysom, who spent 4 years researching this case. Her book, The Last Words of Rowan du Preez, Murder and Conspiracy on the Cape Flats, captures the courtroom drama while delving into the state of policing in the townships of South Africa. Welcome, Simone.
Welcome.
Thanks very much for coming in. Tell me a little bit about yourself first before we start looking into the book. I'd like to know about your work with the Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime.
Sure. So I'm a writer and also a researcher. I work full-time as a senior analyst for the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. It's a bit of a mouthful. Which is a Geneva-based organisation, but which works globally and has a focus on South Africa and East Africa, Southern and East Africa, in addition to some other work. And I actually got into that work through the research I was doing for the book. I was introduced to the head of criminology at UCT, who at that time was Mark Shaw, who runs the organisation, as a result of attending the Khayelitsha Commission.
So you also have degrees. You have degrees from South Africa and from Cambridge. What are those degrees in?
So in South Africa at the University of Cape Town, I did a BA in English Literature and History and an honours in Human Geography. And then in the UK, I did an MPhil in Geography at the University of Cambridge.
Oh. Did you say it was then from this case specifically that got you into criminology, into the interest into that? Mm-hmm. What is it about this case that drew your attention and made you want to write a book about it?
Well, I think the motivation sort of operated on two levels. One was I was looking for, if you will, a small story that would be able to tell a larger story about the challenges the country was facing. Particularly driven by the fact that I often find South Africa a hard place to understand. And I wanted to choose something that in some way baffled me, so that sort of my journey of understanding it could then later be shared with a wider audience. And then I was introduced to Angie through a mutual friend, someone who had been one of her comrades in the activist organisation that she was a member of. Who said to me one day, "I've just come back from Cape Town and the craziest things have been happening to a woman I know." So I had first met Angie a few months before the commission began, and found her story very intriguing, but I was a little bit wary of sort of how complex it could be once one scratched the surface. It was when I started attending the hearings of the Khayelitsha Commission that I really understood how intertwined the two legal processes were, her case, the commission, and how important they both were for sort of understanding police, the possibility of police corruption, the reality of police corruption, and how those link to crime and people's frustrations around the situation that they're living in, particularly in the Cape Flats.
That also complicated this trial a lot, made it very difficult to understand, because the stories, it relies on a lot of memory, and memory over time can get warped. So it was 18 months since the murder and necklacing of Rowan du Preez before the court case started. So people came in, could they actually remember, and then contradictory testimonies coming in. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. So I mean, first of all, to say that the state's evidence rested entirely on testimony. There was basically no forensic evidence that they drew on to make their case. And there were two components to that. One was eyewitness testimony about the assault and abduction that had preceded the murder, that primarily came from Rowan's closest family members and closest friends. And then a statement that the police said they had heard from Rowan du Preez, who was still alive when he was found by the police, and who later died. So that evidence was hearsay, which is normally inadmissible in the court, and a large part of the trial was about determining whether it could be admitted. Now, for that evidence, the police initially said that they had made contemporary notes, but all of them were lost. A lot of the station's documentation that could have corroborated that story, the pocketbooks, the observation book from one of the stations had gone missing. When it came to the eyewitness testimony, people had witnessed these things at night, on a moonless night in a settlement where there weren't working streetlights and there isn't a lot of illumination. In 2 rounds of statement taking, their versions of what had happened that night had changed drastically. So for me, these questions of what are people remembering, are they remembering well? Are they filling in gaps? Are they fabricating the whole thing maybe? Or are they just kind of massaging a memory that is maybe not that sharp? We're very acute.
And what do you think of the defense and how the defense, tell me a little bit about their characters and how they presented the case and how it unfolded?
Sure. So there were 4 people on trial for the murder. 2 of them had a loose link to the Social Justice Coalition, the activist organization that Angie Peter and Isaac Mbadu were part of, and they were represented by a legal aid lawyer. Angie Peter and Isaac Mbadu, through their organization, there had been a lot of fundraising around their case. Amnesty International provided some funding, as did a range of other individuals and organizations. So they were able to hire a senior counsel and a well-respected criminal lawyer, which is completely unaffordable, not just for people on the Cape Flats, but sort of anyone who's not actually quite rich. Legal processes are hugely costly. So this stood them in good stead in that they had someone who was really able to interrogate the documentation that the police were providing, the testimonies, provide quite rigorous cross-examination. Ultimately, however, they didn't win. They were convicted.
So they were convicted, but in your heart, do you feel that Angie was in fact guilty of this, or was there reasonable doubt?
I felt that the state's case was ultimately unconvincing in the sense that it did not quell all reasonable doubts. And one of the things that was frustrating about the judgment was that in many respects, very few reasons were given for why questions the defense had raised around the evidence weren't really addressed. They were deemed irrelevant or glossed over in various ways. So on the pure legal question, was there reasonable doubt? I felt that there was. I think there's a bigger question, which is, do we know what happened that night? To which the answer is no, not really, in part because the investigation was very poor. I did, however, go to Mfuleni and ask my own questions from people who might have seen things, who might have known things in the community, and was able to find out a little bit more, which really confirmed my belief that the conviction was perhaps unwarranted.
Now, as you said a little bit earlier, you did this because to put you in touch with a broader picture of what is happening in South Africa. So if we look at the Cape Flats townships, it's a really very bad and dangerous gangland culture that exists there and that has existed there. It's a very dysfunctional society. Do you think that there is, also over many, many years, many people have tried to do something about it and it hasn't really succeeded? Is there anything that can be done to bring hope to the area?
Both in researching this book and in the broader research I do for the Global Initiative, which has looked at drug markets in the Western Cape, and also this question of state capture of the police and what effect that has on the response to organized crime. I would say the picture really is very bleak at the moment. As a starting point, for Cape Town, the findings of the Khayelitsha Commission had implications not just for Khayelitsha policing, but for policing in high crime areas, particularly in townships which face some specific challenges around the built environment and the socioeconomic conditions. That would be helpful for many areas in the Western Cape, though not all of them face identical challenges. And those findings have been stonewalled by the national level by the police, and could perhaps be revisited. There's also an ongoing court case which the SJC have been pushing around the allocation of policing resources. I do, however, think that the solutions are broader than the police. It's not just about, it's certainly not about more police and paying them a bit more. And you can't ignore the drivers of these criminal markets, and the criminal markets themselves drive police corruption. So there are quite serious questions that South Africa needs to be asking itself about how we conceive of criminal markets, how we respond to them, and who we think plays a role in that response. And I do think it needs to be broader than just thinking about the police and how to fix them.
Now, our discussion so far has been rather intellectual and academic, but the book is actually, it's very readable, and the way that it unfolds the story, it draws you in to it, and it reads almost like a movie, like a TV series. And I was wondering how do you got that feel to the book, and if anybody has offered you or asked you for rights to the story for a movie or TV series?
The answer to the second question is not yet. On the first one, I mean, I grappled really hard with structure, and because I wanted it to be something that would engage people, and also very much something where people would be able to see the humans at the center of it and the human cost of these issues. I wanted everyone to feel like a character with some depth. And in nonfiction, you're quite limited by your material often in that respect. And also, I was very aware that it was quite a dark story, and in a country where we're awash with heavy and depressing realities, you need to give people a reason to stick with it and to face up to those realities and to engage with the complexity. And I think narrative is a very important way of doing that.
Simone, thank you so much. Our time is up, and thanks so much for coming in.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Just to recap, my guest is Simone Haysom, and her book is The Last Words of Rowan du Preez, Murder and Conspiracy on the Cape Flats. And that brings us to the end of today's show. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.